Abraham Lincoln's presidency was so remarkable that Lincoln himself transcended the presidency, becoming an American icon. Today, Lincoln is seen as a marble figure, a martyr, a phenomenon. Lincoln was the father of a second American Revolution and the political legacy we live with today. One nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Yet none of this was ever Lincoln's original intent. Number 16, Abraham Lincoln, Republican, 1861 to 1865, 52 years old, from Illinois.
Lincoln was a conservative in the sense that he wanted to preserve and restore the Union as it had existed before the secession of the southern states and the beginning of the war. But the very events of the war pushed him step by step to the left, toward a more radical position, which eventually became revolutionary.
Lincoln was not the great emancipator. He becomes the great emancipator, to some extent against his own intention. I think that Lincoln shows you what greatness is, really. It is the capacity to grow, to understand a situation, to change.
In Lincoln's lifetime, people either loved him or hated him. One thing they couldn't do was ignore him.
He was very magnetic. He drew people to him, young people especially. Young men who were active in politics thought of him as a god. He had a famous sense of humor. He had an amazing storehouse of anecdotes and jokes for every occasion. It would drive some people crazy, even as president. He would have a story ready that would illustrate a point.
Hidden behind the humor was a very complex man. Lincoln obsessed over matters and often suffered prolonged periods of sadness, frustration, and even despair. Campaign literature called him Honest Abe, banking on his compulsion for seeking the truth. His other nickname, the Rail Splitter, was more of a political marketing invention in the Jacksonian tradition, capitalizing on Lincoln's working-class roots to appeal to the common man.
Lincoln was very much a politician. He loved the game of politics. He played it very well.
He was an extraordinarily ambitious man, like so many politicians who rise to the top are.
From childhood, Lincoln was driven to make something of his life, to climb up out of poverty. He worked hard and relied on his wits, as he had not been blessed with good looks.
In the South, they attacked him as a scoundrelly-looking wretch, the cross between a nutmeg dealer and a horse swapper, whatever that means.
Lincoln turned his appearance into a positive by disarming people with self-deprecating humor. Once, after being called two-faced, he said, "If I were two-faced, would I be wearing this one?" Lincoln was his own best spinmeister. Once elected president, Lincoln chose a cabinet of intellectual equals, just as John F. Kennedy did a century later. In Lincoln's case, 4 of his secretaries had been his political rivals. He was a judicious delegator of authority, but he always reserved the ultimate decision for himself. Lincoln's election had been a political disaster for the Southern slave power, but his initial intention was just to halt the expansion of slavery into the Western territories.
He said if I could save the Union without freeing a single slave, I would do that. If I could save it by freeing some and leaving others in bondage, I would do that too.
He never had anything but moral outrage about it. But he, like most anti-slavery men, felt that the way to kill it, the way to destroy the institution, was to contain it and let it suffocate from within.
Waiting for Lincoln on his first day in office was a letter from Major Robert Anderson, the commander of Fort Sumter, located on an island in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. Anderson warned that without a shipment of provisions, he would have to surrender to the rebels. Lincoln had three options. He could order a surrender, an attack, or send provisions. He chose the latter.
So basically, Lincoln said to Jefferson Davis, if you let this food go in peacefully, it will be a symbolic manifestation of our sovereignty over this fort, the United States sovereignty. If you stop it, then the burden of responsibility for starting a war will be on your shoulders.
Before Lincoln's supply ships arrived, Confederate President Jefferson Davis ordered his men to attack the fort. The first shot was fired. On April 12, 1861, the Civil War had begun. The violence at Fort Sumter motivated 4 more states to join the Confederacy. 4 others remained on the fence. Fort Sumter was surrendered to the South, but Major Anderson saved the American flag that had flown above it and brought it to New York City.
They took that tattered, ripped flag. It was very much like the World Trade Center flag that was displayed all over New York in the fall of 2001. And the flag inspired people. It created flag mania, patriotic fever. In a way, without Sumter, Lincoln might not have stirred up the Union to a move that was necessary to fight to restore the Union, to preserve the Union.
By an act of shrewd calculation, Lincoln had baited the South into striking the first blow of the Civil War. Yet neither he nor Jefferson Davis anticipated what was about to unfold. It would be the first and only American presidency completely defined by war. Lincoln, who made Thanksgiving a national holiday, was also the first to pardon a turkey at Thanksgiving. He named it Jack. In the spring of 1861, Abraham Lincoln became commander-in-chief at the helm of the military effort to save the Union. Possessing no military expertise and humbled at the prospect of making life and death decisions, Lincoln gave himself a crash course on military strategy.
Lincoln did what any intelligent person would do. He went to the Library of Congress and took out books on military strategy and military administration and taught himself.
Lincoln also became personally fascinated with the technology of modern warfare. Within a year, he was well-versed in military tactics and strategy. Yet nothing prepared Lincoln for the problems he was to experience with his generals. In August of 1861, Lincoln was furious upon hearing that Major General John C. Fremont had issued an emancipation proclamation in the border state of Missouri, becoming the first to free slaves owned by Confederates. Fearing Fremont's action would incite slave owners in all of the border states to join the Confederacy, Lincoln nullified Fremont's action and relieved him of duty. In February 1862, Lincoln's war effort was suddenly rocked by personal tragedy. His 11-year-old son, Willie, died from typhoid fever.
I think Lincoln saw most of himself in Willie and just never quite escaped from the veil of very deep melancholy that enveloped him in 1862.
In an effort to properly mourn their son's death, the Lincolns decided to temporarily leave the White House and move to the Soldiers' Home, an asylum for wounded soldiers in Northwest Washington. Finding themselves at peace there among the soldiers, the Lincolns adopted the home as their summer residence, turning Lincoln into a commuter for 1/4 of his presidency. From then on, the war consumed Lincoln. He worked night and day, 7 days a week, 18 or more hours a day. He was so anxious to stay on top of the latest war news, he would sometimes stay late or even all night at the U.S. Telegraph Office. In April 1862, exactly a year after Fort Sumter, the Union Army won a major, critically important victory at the Battle of Shiloh. But it came at a horrendous cost. Nearly 24,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing after the battle. Carnage triggered a turning point when Lincoln and others realized they were going to have to wage a total war. He privately recognized the need to refocus the purpose of the war from merely preserving the Union to addressing the greater moral issue of slavery. In July of 1862, Lincoln confided to his cabinet that he was prepared to surpass the legal powers of the presidency and exploit his unique wartime power as commander-in-chief. He announced his intention to abolish slavery in the rebellious states, not only to undermine the Confederacy's economic strength, but to end slavery in America forever. On September 22, 1862, Abraham Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation to the public.
This war, which began as a conservative effort to restore the status quo antebellum, evolved into a revolutionary war to destroy the old South and its social and economic system.
That's the transformative moment in American history. That's the second Declaration of Independence. That's the moment when Lincoln reaches the level of the Founding Fathers, where he fulfills the promise of the Declaration that had been so long denied to so many millions of individuals who had been denied freedom.
The problem was that the Emancipation Proclamation didn't win battles. Throughout 1862 and 1863, the Union enjoyed success in the West, but that was overshadowed by devastating losses in the East. By June 1863, the military situation in Virginia was getting desperate. Robert E. Lee's rebel army was on a winning streak and marching towards Pennsylvania. It came to a climax in the first days of July near the small farm town of Gettysburg.
The battle was supposed to be the mother of all battles. It was supposed to end the Civil War.
3 horrifying days of massacre ensued. The battleground was soaked in blood. Photographers produced morbid images of the carnage, exposing the nation to the horror of war. These were America's sons, brothers, husbands, lying dead on the battlefield. Lincoln himself sank into despair, overcome by the terrible loss. In November, Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to help commemorate the battlefield as a national military cemetery.
Lincoln spoke for 2 minutes, and what he managed to do in this elegiac masterpiece is redefine the commitment of America to the Declaration of Independence, to the principles that all men are created equal, to laud the sacrifice of people who had given their lives that the nation might live. He believed that America was fighting not just for the promise of today, but what he called a vast future also, that all should have an equal chance and an unfettered start in the race of life, as he put it.
As inspiring as Lincoln's Gettysburg Address had been, Americans were weary of the bloodshed. By 1864, most wanted to see an end to the war. That year, Lincoln ran for re-election against one of his former generals, George B. McClellan, who ran on a platform that promised to negotiate an end to the war if he were elected. It would be a contentious election that would test the resolve of a nation and its president. 9 presidents did not attend college: Washington, Jackson, Van Buren, Taylor, Fillmore, Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, Cleveland, and Truman. In the fall of 1864, Abraham Lincoln was running for his political life against General George B. McClellan. It was a time when Americans could have ended the war by casting their ballots for McClellan, who'd campaigned on a platform that implied he would negotiate an end to the war and, possibly, repeal the Emancipation Proclamation.
But Lincoln is not willing to take those steps that some people say would guarantee his reelection. Rescinding the Emancipation Proclamation, agreeing to an armistice with the South, agreeing to recognize the Southern Confederacy.
When he did refuse to back away, it looked like it would be at the cost of his reelection, because it looked like he would be defeated.
Looking back, it seems inevitable Lincoln's going to win. But it certainly didn't appear that way in 1864.
2 months before the election, the tide turned for Lincoln. General William Tecumseh Sherman had burned Atlanta and would, 10 weeks later, begin his infamous march to the sea. Suddenly, the Union Army had momentum, and so did Lincoln.
Even though America was engaged in a terrible, bloody war, so many casualties, just unimaginable bloodshed and devastation, he still won 56% of the vote in the loyal states in 1864. That in itself is an extraordinary testament to people's faith in Lincoln.
It was a bittersweet victory. The misery of the war had taken its toll on Lincoln, emotionally and physically.
It's hard to find an American president who aged more than Abraham Lincoln did in 3.5 years. I think what you see in his face is knowing that he bore some of the responsibility for this whole disaster.
Four years to the day after Lincoln first took the oath of office, he was taking it again on March 4th, 1865. This time around, Lincoln was a changed man. His visits to the front lines, his experience of living among the wounded at the soldiers' home, and his periodic commute between there and the White House brought him face to face with average Americans and contraband slaves. It had all deeply affected Lincoln, making him empathetic to the humanity of all men. Speaking at his second inaugural, he signaled his growth as a politician and compassion as a man. In what may be the most moving speech ever written by a president, he laid out his roadmap for peace and reconstruction of the nation, pledging malice toward none and charity for all.
He's talking about democracy. He's talking about liberty. He's talking about the necessity of coming to terms with the legacy of slavery for American history.
On April 9th, 1865, just weeks after Lincoln's inauguration, Robert E. Lee surrendered his Confederate Army of Northern Virginia to Ulysses S. Grant. The war was nearly over. Soon after, in what would be his last speech, Lincoln showed no signs of vindictiveness. Echoing the same themes from his inaugural address, he called upon the nation to heal itself. He spoke about giving favorable terms to the South, and for the first time in public, about granting the black man the right to vote.
It would be very easy for Lincoln to say at the end of the war, when Union victory is completely guaranteed, God's on our side. This is what presidents nowadays say. They know what God believes. They got a direct pipeline. Lincoln doesn't do that. Lincoln says we don't know what God's will is, so we've got to rely on our own judgment.
A couple of evenings later, on April 14th, Good Friday, the Lincolns attended Ford's Theater to see the comedy Our American Cousin. It was Lincoln's last night on Earth. Abraham Lincoln had grown up revering the Founding Fathers and the American democratic experiment. It was because of this first revolution that Lincoln was able to enjoy political freedom and equal opportunity. But by trying to save the republic the Founding Fathers had created, Lincoln transformed it and himself.
Lincoln faced the greatest crisis the country had ever seen, and he rises to the occasion. But in rising to the occasion, he changes his views.
Lincoln came to see that everyone, no matter what their race, creed, or religion, had a right to live the American dream.
I think what America is at its best today is a reflection of the steps he took to preserve the Union and to eradicate slavery and to ensure democracy and equal opportunity. I think the fact that we enjoy the opportunity to debate and to quarrel while retaining a single national spirit and a national purpose is all the result of Lincoln's achievement and Lincoln's sacrifice.